King Robert. The Bruce, Chapter 1, The Ancestry of Bruce, when Sir William Wallace, the sole apparent hope of Scottish independence, died at the foot of the gallows in Smithfield, and was torn limb from limb, it seemed that at last the accursed nation would quietly submit to the English yoke. The spectacle of the bleaching bones of the heroic patriot would, it was anticipated, overawe such of his countrymen as might yet cherish perverse aspirations after national freedom. It was a delusive anticipation. In 15 years of arduous diplomacy and warfare, with an astounding expenditure of blood and treasure, Edward I had crushed the leaders and crippled the resources of Scotland, but he had inadequately estimated the spirit of the nation. Only 6 months, and Scotland was again in arms. It is of the irony of fate that the very man destined to bring Edward's calculations to naught had been his most zealous officer in his last campaign, and had, in all probability, been present at the trial, it may be at the execution, of Wallace, silently consenting to his death. That man of destiny was Sir Robert de Bruce, Lord of Annandale and Earl of Carrick. The Bruces came over with the Conqueror. The theory of a Norse origin in a follower of Rollo the Ganger, who established himself in the diocese of Coutances in Manche, Normandy, though not improbable, is but vaguely supported. The name is territorial, and the better opinion is inclined to connect it with Brix, between Cherbourg and Valognes. The first Robert de Bruce on record was probably the leader of the Bruce contingent in the army of the Conqueror. His services must have been conspicuous. He died, about 1094, in possession of some 40,000 acres, comprised in 43 manors in the East and West Ridings of Yorkshire, and 51 in the North Riding and in Durham. The chief manor was Skelton in Cleveland. The next Robert de Bruce, son of the first, received a grant of Annandale from David I, whose companion he had been at the English court. This fief he renounced, probably in favor of his second son, just before the Battle of the Standard, 1138, on the failure of his attempted mediation between David and the English barons. He died in 1141, leaving 2 sons, Adam and Robert. This Robert may be regarded as the true founder of the Scottish branch. He is said to have remained with David in the Battle of the Standard, and, whether for this adherence or on some subsequent occasion, he was established in possession of the Annandale fief, which was confirmed to him by a charter of William the Lion, 1166. He is said to have received from his father the manor of Hurt, and the lands of Hurtness in Durham, to supply him with wheat, which did not grow in Annandale. He died after 1189. The second Robert de Bruce of Annandale, son of the preceding lord, married, 1183, Isabel, daughter of William the Lion, obtaining as her dowry the manor of Haltwhistle in Tyndall. His widow married Robert de Rose in 1191. The uncertainty as to the dates of his father's death and his own has suggested a doubt whether he ever succeeded to the lordship. William de Bruce, a brother, the next lord, died in 1215. The third Robert de Bruce of Annandale, son of William, founded the claim of his descendants to the crown by his marriage with Isabel, second daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, younger brother of William the Lion. He died in 1245. The fourth Robert de Bruce of Annandale, eldest son of the preceding lord, was born in 1210. In 1244, he married Isabel, daughter of Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester. Next year he succeeded to Annandale, and, on his mother's death in 1251, he obtained 10 knights 13 fees in England, her share of the earldom of Huntingdon. He took an active part in public affairs. In 1249–50, he sat as a justice of the King's Bench, and in 1268 he became Chief Justice of England, but Edward, on his accession, 1272, did not reappoint him. He served as Sheriff of Cumberland and Governor of Carlisle Castle in 1254–55, and in 1264 he fought for Henry at Lewes and was taken prisoner. At the same time, de Bruce was a prominent figure in the baronage of Scotland. The alleged arrangement of 1238 whereby Alexander II, with the consent of the Scots Parliament, appointed de Bruce his successor in the event of his dying childless, was frustrated by the king's second marriage, 1239, and the birth of a son, Alexander III, 1241. As one of the 15 regents, 1255, during the minority of Alexander III, he headed the party that favored an English alliance, cemented by the young king's marriage with Margaret, daughter of Henry III. At the Scone Convention on February 5, 1283–84, he was one of the Scots lords that recognized the right of Margaret of Norway. The sudden death of Alexander III, however, in March 1285–86, and the helplessness of the infant queen, put him on the alert for the chances of his own elevation. On September 20, 1286, de Bruce met a number of his friends at Turnberry Castle, the residence of his son, the Earl of Carrick. Their 14 Scots nobles, including de Bruce and the Earl of Carrick, joined in a bond obliging them to give faithful adherence to Richard de Burgh, Earl of Ulster, and Lord Thomas de Clare, de Bruce's brother-in-law, in their affairs. One of the clauses saved the fealty of the parties to the King of England and to him that shall obtain the kingdom of Scotland through blood relationship with King Alexander of blessed memory, according to the ancient customs in the kingdom of Scotland approved and observed. The disguise was very thin. The instrument meant simply that the parties were to act together in support of de Bruce's pretensions to the crown when opportunity should serve. It united the chief influence of the west and south of Scotland against the party of John de Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and the Comyns. 14. There need be no difficulty in connecting this transaction with the outbreak of 1287–88, which devastated Dumfries and Wigton shires. The party of de Bruce took the castles of Dumfries, Biddle, and Wigton, killing and driving out of the country many of the lieges. There remains nothing to show by what means peace was restored, but it may be surmised that Edward interfered to restrain his ambitious vassal, for, by this time, Edward was full of his project for the marriage of the young queen with his eldest son, Prince Edward. The Salisbury Convention, at which de Bruce was one of the Scottish commissioners, and the Brigham Conference, at which the project was openly declared, seemed to strike a fatal blow at the aspirations of de Bruce. But the death of the Queen, reported early in October 1290, again opened up a vista of hope. When the news arrived, the Scots estates were in session. Sir Robert de Bruce, who before did not intend to come to the meeting, wrote the Bishop of St. Andrews to Edward on October 7th, came with great power, to confer with some who were there, but what he intends to do, or how to act, as yet we know not. But the Earls of Mar and Athol are collecting their forces, and some other nobles of the land are drawing to their party. The bishop went on to report a fear of a general war, to recommend Edward to deal wisely with Sir John de Balliol, and to suggest that he should approach the march for the consolation of the Scots people and the saving of bloodshed. The alertness of de Bruce and his friends is conspicuously manifest, and the foremost of the party of Balliol is privately stretching out his hands for the cautious intervention of the English king. The Earl of Fife had been assassinated, the Earl of Buchan was dead, and the remaining 4 guardians divided their influence, the Bishop of St. Andrews and Sir John Comyn siding with Balliol, and the Bishop of Glasgow and the Steward of Scotland with de Bruce. Verdun thus describes the balance of parties in the early part of 1291. The nobles of the kingdom, with its guardians, oftentimes discussed among themselves the question who should be made their 15th king, but they did not make bold to utter what they felt about the right of succession, partly because it was a hard and knotty matter, partly because different people felt differently about such rights and wavered a good deal, partly because they justly feared the power of the parties, which was great, and partly because they had no superior that could, by his unbending power, carry their award into execution or make the parties abide by their decision. The most prominent competitors were liegemen of Edward, and, whether they appealed to warlike or to peaceful methods, the decision must inevitably rest with him. At the Norham meeting of June 1291, de Bruce, as well as the other competitors, fully acknowledged the paramount title of Edward. He had no alternative. He had as large interests in England as in Scotland, and armed opposition was out of the question. Availing himself of his legal experience, he fought the case determinedly and astutely. If Verdun correctly reports the reformation of the law of succession by Malcolm, de Bruce was, in literal technicality, the next descendant. As son of David of Huntingdon's second daughter, he was nearer by 1 degree than Balliol, grandson of David's eldest daughter. But the modern reckoning prevailed. De Bruce's plea that he had been recognized both by Alexander II and by Alexander III was not supported by documentary evidence, and his appeal to the recollection of living witnesses does not seem to have been entertained. His third position, that the crown estates were partible, was but a forlorn hope. He must have seen, long before November 1292, that an adverse decision was a foregone conclusion. He entered a futile protest. Already, in June, he had concluded a secret agreement with the Count of Holland, a competitor never in the running, but a great feudal figure, for mutual aid and counsel. He had also an agreement with the Earl of Sutherland, and, probably enough, with others. But an active dissent was beyond the powers of a man of 82. Accordingly, he resigned his claims in favor of his son, the Earl of Carrick, and retired to Lochmaben, where he died on March 31, 1295, at the age of 85. The 5th Robert de Bruce of Annandale, the eldest son of the competitor, was born in 1253. On his return from the Crusade of 1269, on which he accompanied Prince Edward, afterwards Edward I, he married Marjorie, or 16 Margaret, Countess of Carrick, and thus became by the courtesy of Scotland Earl of Carrick. Marjorie was the daughter and heiress of Nigel, the Celtic, if Celtic be the right epithet, Earl of Carrick, grandson of Gilbert, son of Fergus, Lord of Galloway, and she was the widow of Adam of Kilconquhar, who had died on the recent crusade. De Bruce is said to have met her accidentally when she was out hunting. Verdun gives the romance as follows: when greetings and kisses had been exchanged, as is the wont of courtiers, she besought him to stay and hunt and walk about, and, seeing that he was rather unwilling to do so, she by force, so to speak, with her own hand made him pull up, and brought the knight, though very loath, to her castle of Turnberry with her. After dallying there with his followers for the space of 15 days or more, he clandestinely took the countess to wife, the friends and well-wishers of both parties knowing nothing about it, and the king's consent not having been obtained. And so the common belief of all the country was that she had seized, by force, as it were, this youth for her husband. But when the news came to the ears of King Alexander, he took the castle of Turnberry, and made all her other lands and possessions be acknowledged as his lands, for the reason that she had wedded with Robert de Bruce without consulting his royal majesty. Through the prayers of friends, however, and by a certain sum of money agreed upon, this Robert gained the king's goodwill and the whole domain. It may be, of course, that the responsibility was thrown on the lady in order to restrain the hand of the incensed king. But she was half a dozen years older than de Bruce, who was still in his teens, and was never distinguished for enterprise. In any case, she acted only with the legitimate frankness of her time, and the marriage put a useful dash of lively blood into the veins of the coming king. In every important political step, de Bruce followed with docility his father's lead. He stood aloof from Balliol, and, in spite of marked snubbing, steadily adhered to Edward. From October 1295, he was for 2 years governor of Carlisle Castle. After the collapse of Balliol at Dunbar, he is said to have plucked up courage to claim fulfillment of a promise of Edward's, alleged to have been made in 1292 immediately after the decision in favor of Balliol, to place his father eventually on the Scottish throne. The testy reply of the old dodger, "Al antiquus doli artifex," as reported by Verdun, is at any rate characteristic. "Have I nothing else to do but to win kingdoms to give to you?" The story, though essentially probable, is discredited by the chronicler's assertion that the promise was accompanied by an acknowledgment on the part of Edward that his decision of the great cause was an injustice to de Bruce, the competitor. But while de Bruce took nothing by his loyalty to Edward, he suffered for his disloyalty to Balliol. He had, of course, ignored the summons of Balliol to come in arms to resist the King of England, and consequently Balliol's council had declared him a public enemy and deprived him of his lands of Annandale, giving them to Comyn, Earl of Buchan. At the same time, and for the like reason, his son Robert was deprived of the earldom of Carrick, which de Bruce had resigned to him on November 11, 1292. Annandale, indeed, was restored to de Bruce in September 1296, but the state of Scotland was too disturbed for his comfort, and he retired to his English possessions, where, for the most part at least, he lived quietly till Edward had settled matters at Stratford. He then set out for Annandale, but died on the way, about Easter, 1304, and was buried at the Abbey of Holmcultram in Cumberland. De Bruce left a large family of sons and daughters, most of whom will find conspicuous mention in the story of the eldest brother, Robert, Earl of Carrick, the future King of Scotland. Chapter 2. Opportunist Vacillation. Robert Bruce, the 6th Robert de Bruce of Annandale, and the 7th de Bruce of the Annandale line, was the eldest son of the preceding lord and a grandson of the competitor. He was born on July 11, 1274. The place of his birth is uncertain. Ayrshire says Turnberry, Dumfriesshire says Lochmaben. Geoffrey le Baker calls him an Englishman, Natio Anglicus, and records that he was born in Essex, to which another hand adds, at Riddle, a manor of his father's. Geoffrey, it is true, like several other chroniclers, confuses Bruce with his grandfather, the competitor, and he may mean the competitor, though he says the king. Hemingberg makes Bruce speak to his father's vassals before the Irvine episode as a Scotsman, at any rate by descent. In any case, Bruce was essentially, by upbringing and associations, an Englishman. It was probably in, or at any rate about, the same year that Wallace was born. At the English invasion of 1296, they would both be vigorous young men of 22 or thereabouts. During most part of the next decade, Wallace fought and negotiated and died in his country's cause, and built himself an everlasting name. How was Bruce occupied during this national crisis? Considering the large territorial possessions and wide social interlacings of the family in England, their English upbringing, their traditional service to the English king, their subordinate interest in Scottish affairs, the predominance of the rival house of Balliol, and the masterful character of Edward, it is not at all surprising that Robert Bruce should have preferred the English allegiance when it was necessary for him to choose between England and Scotland. On August 3, 1293, indeed, he offered homage to Balliol on succeeding to the earldom of Carrick. But on March 25, 1296, at Wark, 3 days before Edward crossed the Tweed, he joined with his father and the Earls of March and Angus in a formal acknowledgment of the English king. And on August 28 he, as well as his father, followed the multitude of the principal Scots in doing homage to the Conqueror at Berwick. With this political subjection one is reluctant to associate a more sordid kind of obligation. Some 6 weeks later, October 15th, it is recorded that the king, for the great esteem he has for the good service of Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, commands the barons to return his debts at the exchequer in the easiest manner for him. But the elder Bruce continued to be designated Earl of Carrick in English documents after he had resigned the earldom to his son, and it can hardly be doubted that the debts were his. It is a small matter, indeed, yet one would like to start Bruce without the burden. Early in 1297, Scotland was heaving with unrest. Edward, while busily arranging to cross seas to Flanders, was also pushing forward preparations for a Scottish war. In May, Wallace and Douglas had summarily interrupted the severities of Ormsby, the English justiciar, at Scone, and driven him home in headlong flight. About the same time, or somewhat later, Andrew de Moray took the field in Moray, Macduff rose in Fife, and Sir Alexander of Argyle set upon the adherents of Edward in the west. On May 24th, Edward had addressed, from Portsmouth, a circular order to his chief liegemen north and south of Forth, requiring them to attend certain of his great officers to hear certain matters which he has much at heart, and to act as directed. Bruce was ordered to attend Sir Hugh de Cressingham and Sir Osbert de Spaldington at Berwick. But before the order could have reached him, he must have heard of the expulsion of Ormsby, and had probably conceived dynastic hopes from the aspect of affairs. Indeed, he appears to have fallen under English suspicions. For, no sooner did the news from Scone reach Carlisle than the bishop and his advisers. The bishop was acting governor in the absence of the elder Bruce at Portsmouth, fearing for the faithlessness and inconstancy of Sir Robert de Bruce the younger. Earl 20 of Carrick sent messengers to summon him to come on a day fixed to treat with them about the king's affairs, if so be that he still remained faithful to the king. Bruce duly appeared with a strong following of the people of Galloway, and repeated the oath of fealty upon the consecrated host, and upon the sword of St. Thomas à Becket. What more could the bishop want or do? But Bruce went a step further. He summoned his people, says EDINBURGH, and, in order to feign color, he proceeded to the lands of Sir William de Douglas and burnt part of them with fire, and carried off his wife and children with him to Annandale. For all that, he was already in secret conspiracy with the Bishop of Glasgow, the Steward of Scotland, and Sir John of Bonkill, the steward's brother. Douglas, indeed, presently appears as one of the leaders in the rising, but his relations with Bruce would be subject to easy diplomatic adjustment. When the time for open action arrived, Bruce appealed to his father's men of Annandale. He repudiated his oath at Carlisle as extorted by force and intimidation, and professed a compelling sense of patriotism. The Annandale men deferred reply till the morrow, and slipped away to their homes overnight. With his Carrick men, however, he joined the bishop and the steward, and began to slay and harry the English in the southwest. Engrossed in the outfitting of his expedition, Edward delegated the suppression of the Scots to Warenne, Earl of Surrey, the guardian of Scotland, who sent ahead his kinsman, Sir Henry de Percy, with a strong force. Percy advanced through Annandale to Ayr and, 2 or 3 days later, stood face to face with the insurgents near Irvine. There was dissension in the Scots camp. Sir Richard Lundy went over to Percy, saying that he would no longer war in company with men in discord and at variance. Besides, the English force was no doubt much superior. The insurgent leaders at once asked for terms. The provisional agreement was that their lives, limbs, lands, tenements, goods and chattels should be unharmed, that their offenses should be condoned, and that they should furnish hostages. Such was the humiliating fiasco of July 7, 1297, at Irvine. 21 so far their skins were safe, and now, on the counsel of the bishop, they appealed to Cressingham and Warenne to confirm the agreement, and to vouchsafe an active interest in their behalf with Edward. The full flavor of their pusillanimity can only be gathered from the text of their letter to Warenne. They were afraid the English army would attack them to burn and destroy their lands. Thus, they were told for a certainty that the king meant to seize all the middle people of Scotland to send them beyond sea in his war, in Gascony, to their great damage and destruction. They took counsel to assemble their power to defend themselves from so great damages, until they could have treaty and conference with such persons as had power to abate and diminish such kind of injury, and to give security that they should not be exceedingly aggrieved and dishonored. And therefore, when the host of England entered the land, they went to meet them, and had such a conference that they all came to the peace and the faith of our Lord the King. The hostage for Bruce was his infant daughter Marjorie. It would be interesting to know why Douglas failed to provide hostages. It may be that his native obstinacy was aroused by the objurgations of Wallace, who then lay in Selkirk Forest, and who is said to have displayed intense indignation at the ignominious surrender. Edward ratified the convention, but somehow it was not till November 14th that powers were conferred on the Bishop of Carlisle and Sir Robert de Clifford to receive to the king's peace Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and his friends, as seems best to their discretion. Midway between the shameful collapse at Irvine and the formal submission at Carlisle lay September 11, 1297, and Wallace's memorable victory at Stirling Bridge. In this great triumph of patriotism Bruce had neither part nor lot. Neither was he present at the disastrous Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298. The Scottish chroniclers, indeed, relate the popular story that the English victory was primarily due to Bruce, who, with Bishop Beck, stealthily caught the Scots in the rear and broke up the Chilterns. But this is a complete misconception, due possibly to a confusion of Bruce with Basset, who, with Beck, delivered the attack on the left wing, not on the rear, or with Bruce's uncle, Sir Bernard, who fought on the English side. In any case, Bruce stands clear of Falkirk. For English chroniclers 22 relate that, when Edward withdrew towards Carlisle, Bruce burnt Ayr Castle and fled away into Carrick. Yet it seems all but certain that he was in Edward's allegiance within 3 weeks before the battle. he had gone over before the result reached him, possibly on learning the dire straits of Edward immediately before, or on the strength of a false report of the issue. The stormy meeting of Scots nobles at Peebles on August 19, 1299, discovers Bruce in a remarkable attitude. One object of the meeting was to choose guardians of the realm. The discussion was sufficiently warm, for Sir John Comyn, the Red Comyn, afterwards slain at Dumfries, seized the Earl of Carrick by the throat, and his cousin of Buchan tried to fall with de Lamberton, Wallace's Bishop of St. Andrews. The outcome of the wrangle was a purely personal accommodation of an essentially momentary character. It was settled that the Bishop of St. Andrews, the Earl of Carrick, and Sir John Comyn should be the guardians, the bishop as principal to have custody of the castles. Bruce, through the Wallace influence, had gained the upper hand. But it must have cost him a pang to consent to act in the name of Balliol. Bruce, with Sir David de Brechin, returned to the attack of Lochmaben Peel, where the Scots had been pressing Clifford since the beginning of August. They were unsuccessful in direct assault, but they seriously hindered the victualling of the place by infesting the lines of communication. Bruce would seem to have been in consultation with his colleagues in the Torwood on November 13th. When the Guardians, who were then besieging Stirling, dispatched to Edward an offer to cease hostilities on the terms suggested by the King of France. At any rate, he is named as guardian, and it is to be noted that the guardians write in the name of King John and the community of the realm. Edward was compelled to abandon Stirling to its fate, and Lochmaben fell in the end of the year. Warren's December expedition to the Western March was a failure. Edward, in fact, had been paralyzed by his refractory barons. During the next 2 years, while Comyn was doing his best in the field and Wallace was busy in diplomatic 23 negotiation, there is no trace of Bruce in the records. He may have felt it too irksome to pull together with Comyn. But he reappears, in a new coat, in 1301-2. On February 16th, Edward, at the instance of the Earl of Carrick, granted pardon to a murderous rascal, one Hector Ascaloch. And by April 28, 1302, the king had a special favor granted to the tenants of his liege Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, their lands in England lately taken for their rebellion. And Bruce attended Edward's parliament towards the end of October. In the next year or two, Bruce manifested special devotion to the English king. When Edward was going north on the campaign of 1303, he ordered Bruce to meet him about the middle of May at Roxburgh with all the men-at-arms he could muster, and with 1,000 foot from Carrick and Galloway. On July 14th, Bruce received an advance of pay by the precept of Sir Aymer de Valence, the king's lieutenant south of Forth. On December 30th, he is Edward's sheriff of Lanark. On January 9th, he is Edward's constable of Ayr Castle. His star was deservedly in the ascendant by diligent service. His ardor steadily increased. After the surrender of Comyn and his adherents in February 1303-4, he threw himself heartily into the pursuit of Wallace. On March 3rd, Edward wrote to his loyal and faithful Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, Sir John de Segrave, and their company, applauding their diligence, begging them to complete the business they had begun so well, and urging them, as the cloak is well made, also to make the hood. Wallace and Sir Simon Fraser were hotly pursued southwards, and defeated at Peebles within a week. About this time Bruce must have received news of the death of his father, probably not unexpected. On April 4th, 1304, he was at Hatfield in Essex, whence he wrote to Sir William de Hamilton, the Chancellor, asking him to direct quickly the necessary inquisitions of his father's lands in Essex, Middlesex, and Huntingdon, as he wished to go to the king with them to do homage. On June 14th, having done homage and fealty, he was served heir. The succession to the paternal inheritance was happily achieved. Meantime, on his return north, Bruce had found Edward XXIV in hot eagerness to commence the siege of Stirling, and worked with the energy of gratitude that looks towards favors to come. He undertook the special task of getting up the king's engines to Stirling. On April 16th, the king wrote him thanks for sending up some engines, and gave particular instructions about the great engine of Inverkip, which appears to have been unmanageable for want of a wagon fit to carry the frame. Bruce seems to have been at Inverkip and Glasgow, and wherever else any of the 13 engines were lagging on the road to Stirling. His energy operated in congenial harmony with the fiery expedition of the king, yet there was something in the background of all this enthusiastic service. On June 11th, only 3 days before his loyal and faithful Robert de Bruce did homage and fealty to Edward on succession to his father, Bruce met Bishop Lamberton at Cambuskenneth, and formed with him a secret alliance for mutual aid and defense against all persons whatsoever. Seeing dangers ahead, and wishing to fortify themselves against the attempts of their rivals, they engaged to assist each other to the utmost of their power with counsel and material forces in all their affairs, that neither of them would undertake any important enterprise without consultation with the other, and that they would warn each other against any impending danger, and do their best to avert the same from each other. No particular motives or objects, of course, are specified, but the bishop may have foreseen the likelihood of an invasion of English ecclesiastics, and Bruce would not be slow to perceive the possible value of the moral support of the Church, and of the material aid derivable from the men and lands of the religious houses of the wide episcopate of St. Andrews. At such a moment neither party would affect to forget the Bruce's royal pretensions. We shall hear of this bond again. Stirling surrendered on July 20th, the last of the Scottish fortresses that held out against Edward. Wallace, the last center of opposition, was a fugitive, dogged by emissaries of the English king. In March next year, Bruce was with the king at Westminster, petitioning him for the lands recently held by Sir Ingram de Umfreville and Carrick, a 25 petition substantially granted, and he attended Edward's Parliament in Lent. It is hardly any stretch of probability to believe that he was present, in August, at the trial and execution of the illustrious Wallace, the man that, above all others, paved the way for his elevation to the Scottish throne. Bruce was now in his 32nd year. From his 22nd year onwards, through the 10 years' struggle of Wallace and Comyn, he was 2 parts of the time the active henchman of Edward, and during the other part he is not known to have performed any important service for Scotland. His action during this period, the period of vigorous manhood, of generous impulses and unselfish enthusiasms, contrasts lamentably with the splendor of Wallace's achievement and endeavor, and gravely with the bearing of Comyn. One looks for patriotism and heroism, one finds not a spark of either, but only opportunism, deliberate and ignoble, not to say timid, the conduct of a spotted and inconstant man. Yet Bruce was tenaciously constant to the grand object of his ambition. In the light of his kingly career, this early period has puzzled the historians very strangely, but one cannot affect to be surprised that the friendliest critic is compelled to pronounce the simple enumeration of the facts to be, in truth, a humiliating record. Chapter 3: The Coronation of Bruce. Stirling surrendered and Wallace a fugitive. Edward went home and meditated measures for the government of the conquered country. While yielding no point of substance, he recognized the policy of conciliation in form. He took counsel with the Bishop of Glasgow, the Earl of Carrick, and Sir John de Mowbray, and, ostensibly guided by their suggestions, he appointed a meeting of 10 Scots and 20 English representatives to be held in London in the middle of July. The meeting was subsequently postponed to September. On September 23rd, all the representatives were sworn on our Lord's body, the holy relics, and holy evangels, each severally. The Joint Commission settled 10 points, which were embodied in an ordinance, not a logical or methodical document, but mixing up the broadest projects of legislation and administration with mere personal interests and arrangements. First, the official establishment was set forth. Sir John de Bretagne, Jr., Edward's nephew, being appointed King's Lieutenant and Warden, Sir William de Bevercote's Chancellor, and Sir John de Sandal Chamberlain. Next, justiciars were appointed, a pair for each of the 4 divisions of the country. Then a score of sheriffs were named, nearly all Englishmen, though Scots were eligible. Thereafter, the law was taken in hand. The custom of the Scots and Brets was abolished, and the King's Lieutenant, with English and Scots advisers, was to amend such of the laws and usages which are plainly against God and reason, referring difficulties to the king. For the rest, the articles were mainly particular. One of them applied specifically to Bruce, the Earl of Carrick, to place Kildrummy Castle in the keeping of one for whom he shall answer. The king confirmed the ordinance at 27 Sheen. At the same time, October 26th, apparently, the King's Council for Scotland, 20 members, including the Bishop of St. Andrews, the Earls of Carrick, Buchan, and Athol, Sir John Comyn, and Sir Alexander of Argyll, was sworn in. Bretagne was unable to proceed to Scotland till Lent, and then till Easter, and meantime a commission of 4 was appointed to act for him, the first commissioner being the Bishop of St. Andrews. The king rejoiced at the sure prospect of peace in Scotland. The country was outwardly quiet. Edward had put on the velvet glove. He had restored submissive barons, knights, and lairds to their lands. He had that very day at Sheen doubled the periods within which they might pay their several fines. And he had displayed a general friendly consideration in his ordinance. A fortnight before, October 14th, he had instructed all the English sheriffs that he desired honorable and courteous treatment to be shown to all Scots passing through their jurisdictions. In a short time, he was contemplating a more complete assimilation of the 2 countries, to be arranged in a Union Convention at Carlisle. But in February next, the whole face of affairs was suddenly transformed by the report that Sir Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, had done sacrilegious murder on Sir John Comyn at Dumfries. The accounts of the train of events leading to the death of Comyn, though agreeing in essentials, vary considerably in details. The Scott story may be told first. Verdun, like his compatriots, colors his narrative deeply with the fanciful glow of Bruce's patriotism. He tells how Bruce faithfully laid before Comyn the unworthy thraldom of the country, the cruel and endless torment of the people, and his own kindly project for bringing them relief. Bruce, he says, setting the public advantage before his own, proposed to Comyn 2 alternatives: either take you the crown and give me your lands, or else take my lands and support my claim to the crown. Comyn chose the latter alternative, and the agreement was guaranteed by oaths and embodied in indentures duly sealed. Eventually, however, Comyn betrayed Bruce's confidence, accusing 28 him again and again before the King of England, by envoys and by private letters, and wickedly revealing his secrets. Edward acted with restraint. He sounded Bruce. He even showed him his adversary's letters. He feigned acceptance of his explanations. One evening, however, when the wine glittered in the bowl, he expressed his definite determination to put Bruce to death on the morrow. On hearing this, the Earl of Gloucester at once sent Bruce a broad hint in the form of 12 pence and a pair of spurs. Bruce promptly mounted his horse and rode day and night to his castle of Lochmaben. As he was nearing the border, he met a messenger of Comyn's bearing to Edward the very bond he had made with Comyn. He struck off the man's head and hurried on his way. By appointment, he presently met Comyn in the church of the Friars Minorites at Dumfries. He charged Comyn with treachery. "You lie," replied Comyn, whereupon Bruce stabbed him on the spot. The friars stretched Comyn on the floor behind the altar. "Is your wound mortal?" he was asked. "I think not," he replied. The hopeful answer sealed his fate. His foes, hearing this, gave him another wound, and thus, on February 10, was he taken away from the world. According to Barbour, the alternative proposal proceeded, not from Bruce, but from Comyn, which is far from likely, and it was made as they came riding from Stirling, presumably. Blind Harry, indeed, expressly says so, when Edward and his barons were going home from the siege. Barbour goes beyond Verdun in stating that Comyn actually rode to Edward and placed in his hands the indenture with Bruce's seal. Thereupon, he says, the king was angry out of measure and swore that he would take vengeance on Bruce for his presumption, summoned a council, produced the bond, and demanded of Bruce whether the seal was his. But Bruce obtained 29 respite till next day in order to get his seal and compare it with the bond, and fled the same night with the document in his pocket. The embellishments of later writers, the conversion of Gloucester's 12 pence into other coins, the reversal of Bruce's horse's shoes because of the new fallen snow, and so forth, need not be considered. Barbour makes no mention of an appointment. Bruce rode over to Dumfries, where Comyn was staying, and the tragedy was enacted. Barbour has the same outline of the interview as Verdun, but he remarks that other accounts were current in his time. A picturesque tradition tells how Bruce, on striking the blow, hurried out of the church to his friends. Whereupon Roger de Kirkpatrick and James de Lindsay, seeing his excitement, anxiously inquired how it was with him. "Ill," replied Bruce. "I doubt I have slain the Red Comyn." "You doubt," cried Kirkpatrick. "I'll mak Sicar make sure." And they rushed into the church and buried their daggers in Comyn's body. But if the justiciars were then sitting, and Roger de Kirkpatrick was still one of them, for he and Walter de Burgden were appointed justiciars for Galloway on October 25th, there may be some difficulty in accepting the tradition. The English story commences in Scotland, and it introduces a very important element wholly absent from the principal Scottish versions. The English authorities expressly allege a deliberate purpose on Bruce's part to rid himself of his rival. Both Edinburgh and the Lanercost chronicler state that Bruce sent 2 of his brothers, with guileful intent, to invite Comyn to an interview. Edinburgh names Thomas and Nigel. The fullest account is given by Sir Thomas Grey, who wrote in 1355, just half a century later, but still 20 and 30 years earlier than Barbour and Verdun. Grey records that Bruce dispatched his brothers, Thomas and Nigel, from Lochmaben to Dal Swinton, where Comyn was staying, to invite him to meet Robert in the church at Dumfries, and, moreover, that he instructed them to fall upon Comyn on the way and kill him, a purpose thwarted by the softening effect of Comyn's kindly reception of the youths. "H.M.," said Bruce, on hearing their report, "mill 30 sops you are, and no mistake. Let me meet him." So he advanced to Comyn, and led him up to the high altar. He then opened the question of the condition of Scotland, and invited Comyn's cooperation in an attempt at freedom on the terms already mentioned as contained in the alleged bond between them. "For now is the time," he said, "in the old age of the king." Comyn firmly refused. "No," cried Bruce, "I had other hopes in you. By promise of your own and of your friends, you discovered me to the king by your letters. Since while you live I cannot fulfill my purpose, you shall have your guerdon." On the word, he struck Comyn with his dagger, and some of his companions completed the crime with their swords before the altar. EDINBURGH works up artistically the pacific bearing of Comyn in the face of Bruce's accusations, and this would be likely enough if it be true that Comyn was unarmed and attended by but a small escort. The writer of the Merton MS of the Florus Historiarum, who says Comyn was unarmed, states that he endeavored to wrest Bruce's weapon from his hand, that Bruce's men rushed up and freed their leader, that Comyn got away to the altar, and that Bruce pursued him, and on his persistent refusal to assent, slew him on the spot. A distinct English variation occurs in at least 5 of the records. The Mo Chronicle states that Bruce, on returning to Scotland after the settlement of the ordinance, summoned the Scots earls and barons to Scone to consider the affairs of the realm, and put forward his hereditary claim. He received unanimous support, except that Comyn stood by his oath of fealty to Edward, rejected Bruce's claim with scorn, and at once left the council. The council was adjourned to a future day at Dumfries. Meantime Bruce sent Comyn a friendly invitation. Comyn appeared at Dumfries, and was cordially received by Bruce, but still he maintained his objections, and again he left the council. Bruce drew his sword and followed him, and ran him through the body in the church of the Friars Minorites. The Cambridge Trinity College MS, it may be noted, states that Bruce sent his 2 brothers to invite Comyn to meet him at the Cordeliers of Dumfries. And 31 Geoffrey Le Baker makes Bruce kill Comyn in the midst of the magnates. But these counsels may safely be set aside as grounded on misconceptions. The English allegation of Bruce's purpose of murder seems to invest with a special interest Blind Harry's casual story, with its coincidences and discrepancies. Bruce, says Harry, charged his brother Edward, whom he found at Lochmaben on his arrival, to proceed next day with an armed escort to Dalswinton, and to put Comyn to death if they found him. But they did not find him. On the fall of Comyn, his followers pressed forward and blows were hotly exchanged. Comyn's uncle, Sir Robert, assailed Bruce himself, but failed to pierce his armor, which, the Mo chronicler says, he wore under his clothes, and was cut down by Sir Christopher de Seaton, probably in the cloister, not in the church. Barber adds that many others of Mickle Maine were killed in the melee, and the statement is amply confirmed. While this scene was enacting, the English justiciars were in session in the castle. Thither Bruce and his friends, having overpowered Comyn's adherents, at once proceeded. The justiciars had prudently barricaded the doors, but when Bruce called for fire, they instantly surrendered. Bruce spared their lives, and allowed them to pass over the border without molestation. According to EDINBURGH, it was only after Bruce had got possession of the castle that he learned that Comyn was still alive after his first wound, whereupon, by order of Bruce, the wounded man was dragged from the vestibule, where the friars were tending him, and slain on the steps of the high altar, which was bespattered with his blood. Comyn was slain, according to the usually accepted date, on February 10th. Less than 2 months later, April 5th, Edward affirmed that he had placed complete confidence, plenum fiducium, in Bruce. The profession may be accepted as sincere, for it is on record, under date February 8th, the order would have been made some days earlier, that Edward remitted scutage due by Bruce on succession to his father's estates. We may, therefore, put aside the English part of the Verdun and Barber story, and refuse to believe that Edward dallied with Comyn's allegations, or was such a simpleton as to let Bruce keep possession of the incriminating bond. But was there a bond at all? It is generally accepted that Edward did hold in his hands a bond of Bruce's. But this bond is usually taken to have been the Lamberton indenture, which is supposed to have come into Edward's possession through the instrumentality of Comyn. Still, there is nothing to show that this indenture was yet in Edward's hands. It may also be gravely doubted whether Comyn would ever have entered into any bond with Bruce. There is much significance in the silence of the English records. Nor is there more than a very slight English indication of any communication about Bruce from Comyn to Edward. It is likely enough, however, that Comyn informed Edward of Bruce's private pushing of his claims, and it may be that the details of the story of a bond were evolved on mere suppositions arising out of the Bruce-Lamberton compact. The allegation that Bruce deliberately murdered Comyn is the most serious matter. But the English writers do not satisfy one, that they had the means of seeing into Bruce's mind, and the allegation may be reasonably regarded as inference, not fact. There can scarcely be any doubt that Bruce resumed the active furtherance of his claims on observation of the declining health of Edward, but without any immediate intention of a rupture. He could hardly have found support enough to counterbalance the far-reaching power of Comyn, to say nothing of the power of Edward. Clearly it was of the very first importance that he should, if possible, gain over Comyn. He may have offered Comyn broad lands and high honors, but to expect the practical heir of the Balliol claims to support him was, on the face of it, all but hopeless, and to speak of patriotism to Comyn would have been nothing less than open insult. Comyn, of course, would stanchly reject Bruce's overtures. Despite all his prudence, Bruce had a hot and imperious temper, and Comyn's obstinacy, it may be Comyn's frank speech, most probably broke down his self-command. If it had been Bruce's deliberate purpose to kill his rival, he would scarcely have chosen a church for the scene, or have left the deed to be afterwards completed either by others or by himself. The mere fact that he was totally unprepared for a struggle with Edward tells almost conclusively against the theory of premeditation, unless there was a very clearly compromising bond with Comyn, which is wholly improbable. The bond with Lamberton, the only bond that certainly existed, was capable of easy explanation, and was a wholly insufficient reason to urge him to murder a rival, whose adherents would make up in bitterness what they lost in leadership, nor is there any reason to believe that Lamberton was implicated. True, he was charged, on his own bond, with complicity in the deed. There still exist letters patent, dated Scotland's Well, June 9, 1306, in which Lamberton declares to Sir Aymer de Valence, then Edward's lieutenant in Scotland, his anxious desire to defend himself in any way the king or council may devise against the charge of having incurred any kind of guilt in the death of Sir John Comyn or of Sir Robert his uncle, or in relation to the war then begun, and on August 9th. At Newcastle, he acknowledged the Cambuscaneth indenture. But there is no necessary connection between the compact and the crime, and it is in the last degree improbable that Lamberton had any anticipation whatever of the Dumfries tragedy. His sympathy with Bruce's rising is quite a different consideration. Having garrisoned Dumfries Castle, Bruce sent out his messengers to raise adherents. The Galwegians having refused to join him, he ravaged their lands, and he took the castles of Tibers, Durrisdeer, and Ayr. But he was not strong enough to keep the castles for more than a very short period. After the first surprise, Comyn's men asserted their superior force, and aid arrived from Carlisle. The Lanercost chronicler records that Bruce pursued a Galwegian noble and besieged him in a lake, but that the Carlisle contingent raised the siege, compelling Bruce to burn his machines and ships and take to flight. Probably Carlaverock is meant. Leaving the local struggle to lieutenants, Bruce hastened to Bishop Wishart in Glasgow. At Ericstone, in the upper end of Annandale, Barbour says, he was joined by James of Douglas, who had been staying with the Bishop of St. Andrews, a young man destined to play a great part in the history of Bruce. Bishop Wishart joyously received his visitor, cheerfully broke his sixth oath of fealty to Edward, pronounced absolution of Bruce for the murder of Comyn, and produced coronation robes and a royal banner. There was nothing half-hearted about the flexible prelate. Already the country was in eager expectation, and Bruce and the bishop proceeded boldly to Scone. On March 27, 1306, in the Chapel Royal of Scone, the immemorial scene of the inauguration of the kings of the Scots. Robert Bruce was crowned king. The ceremony inevitably lacked certain of the traditional accessories that strangely influenced the popular mind. The venerable stone of destiny had been carried off by Edward 10 years before. The crown, if crown there had been, was also gone, and the ancient royal robes, if such there had been, were no longer available. The prescient bishop, however, had provided fresh robes, and a circlet of gold was made to do duty for a crown. Still, there was lacking an important functionary, the person whose office and privilege it was to place the crown on the head of the king. The proper official was the chief of the clan Macduff, but Duncan, Earl of Fife, was in wardship in England, and again, as on the coronation of Balliol, arose the difficulty of finding an efficacious substitute. No substitute was forthcoming, and the coronation had to pass with maimed rites. 2 days later, however, this difficulty was dramatically solved. Isabella, Countess of Buchan, and sister of the Earl of Fife, had hastened south with an imposing retinue, and appeared to claim the honor and privilege of her house. A second coronation, not mentioned by the Scottish writers, was held on March 29th. The wife of a Comyn, nearly related to the murdered Sir John, the Countess yet performed the mystic function. It would be an exceedingly interesting thing if one could now disentangle the extraordinary complication of ideas and influences involved in this remarkable ceremonial. The subsequent punishment of the Countess by Edward continued the romance of the occasion, and it may be added here that, on March 20th, 1306-7, Edward, at the instance of his queen, pardoned one Geoffrey de Conyers for concealing the coronet of gold with which King Robert was crowned. The coronation might have been expected to strike the imagination of the Scots, and to rally the spirit that cherished the memory of Wallace. Verdun asserts that Bruce's friends in Scotland, as compared with his collective foes, were but as a single drop compared with the waves of the sea, or as a single grain of seed compared with the multitudinous sand. The hyperbole has a considerable basis of fact. Bruce, indeed, was supported at his coronation by the two chief prelates of Scotland, the bishops of St. Andrews and Glasgow, and by the abbot of Scone. By strong-handed relatives, his 4 brothers, Edward, Thomas, Alexander, and Nigel, his nephew, Thomas Randolph of Stratton, better known afterwards as Randolph, Earl of Moray, and his brother-in-law, Sir Christopher de Seaton, husband of his sister Christian, by the Earls of Lennox, Athol, and Errol, and by such valorous men as James de Douglas, Hugh de la Haye, brother of Errol, David Berkeley of Cairns, Alexander, brother of Sir Simon Fraser, Walter de Somerville of Carnwath, David de Inchmartin, Robert Boyd, and Robert Fleming. Apart from the episcopal influence, however, the array is not very imposing. Yet how vastly superior to the meager beginnings of Wallace! Bruce, indeed, lacked one vital source of strength, that his great predecessor had intimate association and sympathy with the common folk, but on the other hand, he was admitted, except by the common interest, to be the legitimate sovereign. And is not the king's name 20,000 names? And so it would have been, but for his inglorious record. It is only the servile adulation of later writers that has pictured Bruce as animated by patriotism. He was simply a great Anglo-Norman baron in quest of aggrandizement, and it took many years to satisfy the people generally that their interests were safe in his keeping. But he was a man with deep reserves of strength, freed at last from the paralysis of worldly prudence by a sudden shock, and compelled to defend his crown and his life with his back to the wall. Happily, if only incidentally, such self-defense involved the championship of the independence of Scotland.